Welcome to this Film Masters restoration of one of my favorite films, Bert I. Gordon's Tormented from 1960. My name is Gary D. Rhodes. I'm the author of many books on film history, including particularly horror film history from its earliest days in the 19th century all the way to modern releases. But this film I'm particularly excited to talk about because of, well, I love it so very much. Also, because I was close friends with one of the supporting actors in this film, the late Joseph Turkel. When it comes to Bert I. Gordon, Bert Ira Gordon, his full name, who died in 2023 at the grand old age of 100, most of us would always think about his big bug movies, his giant monsters of various types. Mr. Big, of course, as he was dubbed by my old friend, the late Forrest J. Ackerman. Gordon's career was extensive, it was important. It certainly was not of the sheer volume of films or quality of films in many cases as Roger Corman. Also, of course, we may not consider Mr. Big's films to be quite on the level of artistic achievement of anyone from, say, Todd Browning and James Whale through, possibly John Carpenter or even George Romero. But there's a fascinating array of films he made, particularly in the 1950s, that deserve mention and appreciation. And, of course, here we're talking about films like King Dinosaur from 1955. We're talking about The Amazing Colossal Man from 1957, which was kind of a fascinating riff or inversion, really, on Jack Arnold's film The Incredible Shrinking Man. And, of course, one of my favorites of Gordon's work was Earth versus the Spider from 1958, sometimes known simply as The Spider, and something itself of a riff on an earlier film, another Jack Arnold film, Tarantula, from 1955. So I've long loved these films, so many of us do. Even before I saw Bert I. Gordon's film War of the Colossal Beast from 1958, long before I saw it, actually, I saw still images in horror movie magazines when I was a little child that certainly scared me and wonderfully frightened me. When it comes to Tormented, though, we are faced with a film that's very much out of the ordinary style and types of special effects that we associate with Gordon. This is another reason why it fascinates me so much, because it's unusual for Gordon, it's unusual to some extent for its time period, and it's absolutely wonderful. The first we really get to hear about Tormented in the industry press came in July 1959. Variety reported the following, and I quote, "Bert I. Gordon and Joe Steinberg have set up Cheviot Productions as an indie film unit. Initial project to be Tormented, scripted by George Worthing Yates from a Gordon original. Pair will co-produce and Gordon will direct. 2 additional properties currently are being readied as follow-ups. No releasing deal yet has been inked," end quote. So, of course, we know about Bert Gordon. The Joseph Steinberg that's mentioned there is a fascinating fellow in his own right, a producer of the period, an indie producer, who by 1960 was starting to explore increasingly shooting outside of America. That wasn't the case with Tormented, but it was for some of the other projects Steinberg was interested in. He actually said to the press by 1960 that it was getting really impractical to shoot films in America because of rising costs. And he looked, among other places, particularly towards the Philippines. This is an early example, one of the early examples of what became known as runaway productions in Hollywood in the 1960s. Coming out of the fact that rising production costs meant some looked towards shooting in other countries, some filmmakers, some producers. It really follows a larger trajectory, I think, of a type of financial decline that Hollywood suffered after World War II. Everybody thought, at least most people, that after World War II, the sheer number of soldiers coming home, the baby boom, so many things would lead to another golden age of Hollywood ticket sales, box office receipts. And if we had been there in 1946, we would have actually believed that with good reason, because it was true that year. Starting in 1947, though, and into the 50s and 60s, Hollywood suffered all kinds of losses. And there were various reasons for this. One of them being, of course, maybe most famously, television, and the fact so many viewers, so many young families started buying television sets in the late 40s and certainly into the early, late 50s, and watched content at home. There were all kinds of other reasons, too, certainly that were given at the time, as well as in retrospect by historians. The rise of other leisure time activities, for example, the popularity of bowling. And of course, there were other reasons as well. On the one hand, Hollywood losing money at the box office for these kinds of reasons, it seemed. And then the power, the post-war power of unions in Hollywood, requiring more pay for workers in front of and behind the camera. Joe Steinberg, who is our producer here for Tormented, was somebody who was very much interested in, as many became, shooting in other countries for low-budget films, for independent films. Of course, it's Bert I. Gordon that's the better remembered of the two, and rightly so, perhaps, given the horror films he made. There's a wonderful article Variety published about Gordon in 1958, not terribly long before Gordon thought of the idea for Tormented. And I'd like to read this article. It's, I think, very instructive in terms of Gordon's thinking in these matters. The article reads, quote, "Exploitation pics needn't be horror pics. Their value is in fantasy, and they can be made well enough to be a regular staple of the film industry, according to Bert I. Gordon, who has made 7 in the past 4 years. Gordon, now winding a 4-pic pact with American International Pictures, said that his first 4 fantasy pics, he dislikes the term horror, were made for a total of $429,500 and netted $1,071,000. Any way you look at it, he commented, that's healthy for the industry as a whole. Gordon disagrees with those who issue a blanket condemnation of all exploitation pics. We use pathos, love, tenderness, and imagination, he said. Horror is the least important element, and in most cases, in our pictures at least, an element entirely lacking. Special effects are the backbone of his pics, Gordon said, and with special effects you can make a $150,000 picture look like $600,000. Gordon said his first pic, King Dinosaur, was made for less than $50,000 and netted $55,000 for Robert Lippert, who bought it. He said his second, The Cyclops, for RKO Allied Artists, cost $71,500 and netted $68,000. On the basis of comparison in similar situations, Gordon predicted that his latest 2 for AIP, the duo The Fantastic Puppet People and The Revenge of the Colossal Beast, made for a total of less than $300,000, will do better than any of the previous picks. He is now editing The Spider, last on his AIP deal, which cost $146,000. Far from being a bad influence, said Gordon, his picks have been praised in an official publication of the Parent Teachers Association. As an addenda to that article, we can note, of course, that the 2 films mentioned therein were actually released under the titles Attack of the Puppet People and War of the Colossal Beast. At any rate, that gets us really closer to the timing of Tormented, and the fact that in his autobiography, Bert I. Gordon later remembered, quote, I sat down and wrote a screenplay of a weird ghost story and decided to make this one independently with private money. I raised part of the budget from an investor, and the rest came from my own funds." End quote. This may well, of course, be true. There's no doubt Gordon wrote the story for Tormented. He may have also written a first draft screenplay. But we do know for sure that the screenplay, as was filmed, in fact, the screenplay that was submitted to the Production Code Administration in the summer of 1959, was actually written by George Worthing Yates. Yates is a fascinating writer. I think, like so many screenwriters and cinematographers and other wonderful people, art directors that work in films, there's not enough that's been written about them because so much of the attention goes to stars and directors. But it is, of course, certainly worth thinking about some of these other fascinating talents. When it comes to George Worthing Yates, he was the nephew of Herbert Yates, the head of Republic Pictures. Our Yates, the screenwriter, began his writing career with murder mystery type novels, such as The Body That Came by Post in 1937, The Body That Wasn't Uncle, 1938, There Was a Crooked Man, 1940, and one that's actually been republished in modern times, If a Body, from 1941. Prior to his work with Gordon, Yates wrote the story for Them from 1954, one of the great, maybe the greatest of all the big bug movies of the 50s. One of the film titles, I love all of them, that occur occasionally, film titles that end in exclamation points, like Oliver or Oklahoma, or in this case, Yates and his story for Them. He also wrote the screenplay for Earth versus the Flying Saucers. It Came from Beneath the Sea. He wrote the screenplay for Frankenstein 1970, which was a 1958 film release. And he had written some of Gordon's other screenplays, like Earth versus the Spider, War of the Colossal Beast, and Attack of the Puppet People. So, fascinating writer, fascinating script. The script gets approval from the PCA in July of 1959. Technically, it was July 27th. The PCA's power in Hollywood was starting to wane around this period, as it, of course, continued to do in accelerated fashion in the 1960s. But PCA approval was in place. The film was slowly trudging forward. The Los Angeles Times reported that Tormented would be given, quote, the diabolique treatment. The reference here to Henri-Georges Clouzot's 1955 film, Les Diaboliques. Of course, Les Diaboliques was the film that Hitchcock really wanted to make, and in some ways may have even inspired Hitchcock in the direction of Psycho in 1960. Les Diaboliques being, of course, about a wife of a man and his mistress jointly plotting to murder him. By August 1959, the press announced that the film Tormented would have two particular stars, Susan Gordon and Richard Carlson. Susan Gordon, of course, was the daughter of Bert I. Gordon, a child actress, stellar child actress. By the time of Tormented, she had already been in her father's Attack of the Puppet People, as well as in Gordon's film The Boy and the Pirates, which was 1960 and released some months before Tormented. Gordon wasn't just an actress who appeared in her dad's movies, though. She made many other film and television show appearances, including on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and a tremendous episode of The Twilight Zone from 1962, an episode called The Fugitive, a rather well-remembered episode in which Susan played a little girl who wears a leg brace, and she becomes friendly with an alien. The aforementioned reference of Tormented to be in the style of Les Diaboliques becomes further interesting when we consider the casting, because, of course, Les Diaboliques starred not only Simone Signoret, but also Vera Clouzot, the director's wife, and, of course, here in Tormented, Bert I. Gordon is featuring his daughter. And then, of course, we come to Richard Carlson, who was born in 1912, stage actor, then a film actor, but his best-known films didn't really come, the best-remembered ones, didn't really come until he was in his 40s. Here I'm talking about, let's say, The Magnetic Monster and The Maze from 1953, but of course much more famously Jack Arnold's It Came from Outer Space, also 1953, and Arnold's Creature from the Black Lagoon of 1954. And I think Carlson was a wonderful actor. He is perhaps not unlike David Manners in some respects. David Manners, the very talented actor, so famed at the time for performances in films like Journey's End of 1930. But Manners, who found himself best remembered for a trio of horror films, Dracula in 1931, The Mummy in 1932, The Black Cat in 1934. We could even mention a few others, but Manners spoke even at the time, even when he was in Dracula in 1931, he spoke about, I'm basically playing one of these characters in a film where I'm just kind of walking around as other things are happening and my character doesn't believe in them or can't or shouldn't believe in them. He said something to that effect, and I think there's a bit of a relationship there between Manners and Carlson because they did so much other work, but they're known now simply for their work in horror. Carlson was actually in films as early as 1938, his first being The Young in Heart, which was a David O. Selznick produced film starring Janet Gaynor and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And at first it looked like Carlson had a really budding career as a young male lead, somebody who was maybe the real possibility of becoming a major star. For example, at the end of the 30s, Modern Screen, one of the popular film fan magazines, wrote the following, and I quote, "When they assigned Richard Carlson to play the Scotsman opposite Janet Gaynor in The Young at Heart, and tried to persuade him that he'd sound more romantic as Richard Carlton, or better still, Carlton Richards, he said, 'Carlson's a good name. I'll keep it.' His father was pleased by Richard's decision, and his father's pleasure is important to Richard. But that's not the whole of it. Every man is the product of his background. Not every man is as intelligently aware of his background as young Carlson. He was unwilling to repudiate it by so much as a symbol. He wasn't bent on being an actor, but if he was going to make a name for himself in any field, he wanted that name to be his own. Achievement by any other would smell less sweet. You can't tell his story except in relation to his family. The father he loves and admires, the mother he teases and adores, his sister Margaret, who died 1.5 years ago, but of whom they all talk as if she were still among them. His sister Ruth, who came to New York to write, but met and married a charming Irishman instead. His brother Henry, and Henry's wife, and their baby Karen. Last Christmas, Richard went from shop to shop seeking the perfect winter outfit for Karen. It's got to be something with extra dash, he told all the saleswomen. It's for the nicest baby in the world. And I'm her uncle." End quote. So that article obviously played off his familial ties. It wasn't the only fan magazine article of the period, though, with this moment when it looked like his career was about to really take off. Not long thereafter, the fan magazine called Motion Picture published another article about Richard Carlson, which said, quote, "Richard Carlson has made 5 pictures. In 4 of them, he has been a college hero, either as a student or as a young professor. Consciously or unconsciously, Hollywood has been building him up as the co-ed's delight. But Hollywood has been building up to an awful letdown. He says he won't make any more college pictures. He doesn't want to be a glamour boy. With a cheerful grin, he says, "I haven't the face for it." What he means is that he hasn't the stomach for it. This may seem a strange attitude for someone in whom Hollywood has discovered definite possibilities, and upon whom, accordingly, it wants to lavish gold and glory. He isn't averse to glory and gold. He simply doesn't crave them as the co-ed's delight. He has, he hopes, other possibilities, end quote. Those other possibilities, of course, ended up being a somewhat mediocre career until at least the films of the 50s for which we best remember him. At any rate, Mr. Big had Susan Gordon and Richard Carlson. He had a great, unique story, a script from Yates that had been approved by the PCA, and at a given point, by the summer of 1960, he made a deal with Steve Broidy at Allied Artists to release Tormented. With regard to the production itself, unfortunately not a whole lot is known about it. Gordon writes about it in his autobiography, but not at much length. What he does say, though, is certainly worth quoting. And he writes, quote, "I moved into the Hal Roach studio in Culver City and started casting the film and setting the crew. Much of the film was shot in a house on the shore near Malibu. Since the lighthouse was an important feature of the film, it had to be special. But the great lighthouses existed primarily on New England's Atlantic coast. The film wasn't budgeted to travel the cast and crew to New England to film the movie there, so we had a big problem. Throughout the filming of the movie, the script called for certain members of the cast to enter or exit the lighthouse, so I directed them to do exactly that, even though they were walking in and out of nothing but empty space on the shore. Then, upon finding a great lighthouse on the Atlantic coast near Salem, Massachusetts, I brought it back to California, on film. Upon the completion of the principal photography, I combined the scenes we had shot with the actors, together with the lighthouse footage I filmed on the East Coast, and with the help of an optical printer, the problem was solved. In the finished film, the audience views the actors walking in or out of the lighthouse from the sandy beach, and in other scenes appearing on the lighthouse balcony at the top. All of it with movie magic." End quote. As I mentioned earlier, I was very good friends with Joe Turkel. We became very close friends in the late 1990s through until the time of his death. He was absolutely fabulous, tremendous friend. His gift at my wedding, his certainly support at the time of my divorce. He was a true friend, and I think Joe was the kind of person that made friends easily. He was well-liked. Everybody loved him. Other actors I've known and worked with, like William Sanderson, spoke so very highly of him. And to be out with Joe at a restaurant, for example, it was tremendous. He was exceedingly friendly to everybody, but it wasn't just the friendliness, it was the personality. The big personality, and yet so very different than the kinds of screen roles for which he was known. He loved to talk to people, to meet new people. He was always wishing everyone the best. He truly was a great champ in my eyes. I suppose, of course, most of the American public, the film-going public, know him for his role in Blade Runner of 1982. His absolutely amazing role as Tyrell, and his death scene with Rutger Hauer, who also, of course, spoke so very highly of Joe. And then, of course, we think of Joe for, well, certainly I do, maybe most of all, for his role in The Shining in 1980, the Kubrick horror film based on the Stephen King novel. In that film, Joe plays a bartender, of course, a ghostly bartender who seems to appear at the exact moment that Jack Nicholson suggests he'll sell his soul if he could only get a drink. This kind of a Faustian bargain that occurs. Joe seems so very scary in that role to me when I saw the film at the age of 8 or 9. And I later told him, in fact, when I dedicated a book to him, I dedicated it to the man who had scared me so much as a kid, but who was so delightful in real life, so always chipper and enthusiastic and wonderful. And it meant a great deal to me that he liked the dedication enough. I gave him a copy of the book, of course, but then he ended up buying, as I recall, some copies to give to his brother and other people. Joe, of course, was born in Brooklyn in 1927, and he was in films from 1948, so he was quite seasoned even by the time of Tormented, long before the other films like Blade Runner that I mentioned. In fact, he had, by the time of Tormented, he had already worked with Bert I. Gordon in The Boy and the Pirates, and he had already worked with Kubrick twice. There were only 2 actors that appeared in 3 separate Kubrick films. One was Philip Stone, the other was Joe Turkel, and if I may say, as much as I love both actors, I think Joe's parts were more prominent in his respective trio of Kubrick films than were Stone's. At any rate, by the time of Tormented, Joe had appeared in The Killing, 1956, wonderful heist storyline film, and perhaps more famously, he had appeared in Paths of Glory, 1960, the famous World War I picture starring Kirk Douglas, in which Douglas defends 3 men at a military tribunal, one of the 3 being Joe. And so it was wonderful always talking with him about all of his films, and I loved, of course, talking with him over and over again, the stories he had of everyone from Samuel Fuller to Shelley Winters, just tremendous stuff. And Joe always loved talking about the old days. We had such great times chatting about many subjects, everything from American history and politics through religion, everything you could imagine that friends would discuss. But we so often, at my behest, really talked about his days in Hollywood, the film stories. And of course, that brings me to Tormented. And I think it was probably the only time I ever saw or feel Joe move out of his friendly, chipper, wonderful personality. That was when I asked him about Tormented. I love the film, of course, and I don't really know his feelings about the film because he immediately went to Richard Carlson, the star, and how much he despised Carlson. The anger was apparent. Joe seemed, in this rare case, this saintly fellow seemed livid. And I quietly listened as he told a quick story. And as much as Joe and I kept talking for years, I never returned to the subject of Tormented. I don't know quite the full context, but for some reason, Carlson had a prop gun. And as I sit recording, I'm hearing about prop guns and real bullets and everything on the set of the Alec Baldwin Western Rust, and the dangers of prop guns. And of course, we can even think back to Jimmy Cagney talking about how in some of the Warner Brothers gangster films of the 30s, they used real guns and real bullets, at times at least. And, you know, the dangers and everything present always with firearms and so forth. Well, for some reason, Carlson had the prop gun, and as a joke, fired it close to Joe's ear. And that was the start of a lifelong problem that Joe had. Tinnitus, he pronounced it. Friends of mine in the UK often pronounce it that way. Tinnitus, some people say. At any rate, this kind of ringing in the ears, I didn't proceed to ask, how bad it was. I don't think, I'm thinking back to a conversation over 2 decades ago. I don't think I asked about how constant the ringing was, how bad it was. I had the impression, as I think back, that it was something that was a problem, but not an overly severe problem, something maybe that came and went or so forth. But that was the Joe Turkel story about Tormented and Carlson, that this something of a buffoon on the set, I think Joe would say, this kind of arrogant jerk on the set, thought he was cute, making a silly joke with a younger actor, even though, of course, Joe's credits, even by that time, were so strong, his film credits. But the gun went off, and Joe's memory of Tormented was itself quite tormented in the way I've described. By contrast, of course, most of Joe's stories about working with people on sets were fascinating, were wonderful, were jubilant. I think a lot about his stories, the stories he told me about Kubrick, and for example, with The Killing, he very clearly recalled Kubrick setting up the camera in a certain way and the cinematographer changing it because the cinematographer believed that much the same effect, much the same look could be accomplished by changing the camera setup. It would make the same effect, but be more simple. And Kubrick, much younger than the cinematographer on The Killing, had to express his, shall we say, great anger and impose his authority that it was going to be done Kubrick's way, the kind of perfectionist that Kubrick was. And so that's one story I remember. He talked about Kubrick. Another story I remember, and Joe had written his memoirs, but by the time he passed away, they've not yet been published. I certainly hope they will. But Joe had told me the story about getting Kubrick to try vitamins. Joe was very fascinating. He was in some ways ahead of his time as a Californian, a transplanted Brooklynite in California, and he loved Santa Monica. He loved the climate, the lifestyle, everything about California. And but long before L.A. became so health conscious, Joe was. He was into eating extremely healthily. He was into taking vitamins. When we would meet for lunch or dinner, whatever time, he would always have a little pill bottle full of various vitamins that he would take. He extolled their virtues to me, really, the first time we met. And we continued to have discussions about, vitamins and all of that as time went on. Well, I remember he did the same with Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick started trying a bunch of vitamins at Joe's suggestion, and then the phone call came a few days later. It came in the middle of the night, as I recall. These conversations do go back many years, but it was a wonderful story. I think I had him tell it more than once, Joe, that the call came in the middle of the night. A somewhat worried, maybe a somewhat irritated Stanley Kubrick phoning Joe Turkel. And the reason he was phoning him was that, frankly, his urine had changed color to something of an orange. Well, Joe had rightly convinced Stanley to get trying vitamins, but Joe had forgot to tell him that it might change the color of shall we say, maturation initially. And that led to this middle of the night phone call with Kubrick, worried about what was going on with his health. That was one story I remember. I remember Joe talked a lot about some of the joking back and forth he did with Kubrick. Kubrick being from the Bronx, Joe from Brooklyn, and I think Joe remembered one back and forth exchange where he told Kubrick, the Bronx is the low rent neighborhood. And Kubrick's rejoinder was that Brooklyn was the no-rent neighborhood. So they had, I think they shared some background, some history, some culture, and where they grew up and so forth, and had climbed up the ladder both individually, so with through hard work and effort. So many great Kubrick stories. The final story I'll share, most of these Joe was saving for his book, and there were so many of them. It was delightful. I once had him come speak at the University of Oklahoma, and of course he had a full house with fans of the Kubrick films and The Shining, the Blade Runner, all of it, and made such an impression on everybody there, and partially through telling stories about Stanley Kubrick. I'll share one last one that he found fascinating because he was so interested in Kubrick's level of perfection, and he was interested in different directors. I mean, among Joe's best-known films was Sand Pebbles, directed by Robert Wise, and they remained friends until the time of Mr. Wise's death, and I had known both of them, and so one occasion we were actually all three together when Joe was thinking about making an independent film from a script he had written, and that goes back to, say, roughly the year, I don't know exactly when, sometime in the 90s, late 90s. At any rate, the final story I'll share of Joe, one of the most beloved friends I've ever had. He loved and was so interested in the perfection and perfectionism of Stanley Kubrick. He was so interested in the lengths and extent to which Stanley would go to get things perfect. But then he was also intrigued by Stanley's ability to change his mind quickly and discard something that had been worked on for quite some time. And so particularly I'll mention the story that Stanley had Joe, after he went to England to appear in The Shining, he had Joe study with one or more elder bartenders to find out, the proper way of pouring a drink, the proper way of serving a drink, the old-fashioned styles, because as some of you will recall, the scene in The Shining, initially shows up and it's just he and Jack Nicholson's character, but then later there's a kind of 1920s party that's going on, and so Nicholson is out of time in more ways than one in that film, his character, but Joe and the others seem to stem from the 20s, the roaring 20s, and so, Joe study how people poured drinks then, the proper way, all of that kind of thing. And Joe explained to me, and he would act it out on more than one occasion, it was wonderful, how he learned, thanks to the people he studied with, how to pour the drink, how to serve it, and when he tried it on the set the first time, after all of the work and study that had gone into it, Stanley was, no, absolutely we can't do it that way, do it this other way. And Joe found that fascinating, that here was this perfectionist and so much time spent on so many things, but then there was also an intuitive side that was just sometimes rather quick in thinking, nope, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it another. And of course, Joe loved Kubrick. He loved the Kubrick stories and enjoyed making all of those 3 films with Stanley. And so I'm glad to take a bit of an aside to share a few, because I can't share much more on Tormented from Joe other than that rather tragic prank gone wrong of Richard Carlson's and the prop gun. Well, let's now return to Tormented specifically and think about that distribution deal I mentioned with Allied artists. In 1960, the trade publication Film Bulletin wrote the following, quote, "A few months back, Allied Artists President Steve Broidy announced that his company was nearing completion of its transition to a big picture policy. The pictures now on our planning boards," he noted, "are all important properties. The only future exceptions to this format," Broidy added, "will be unusual subjects in the medium budget category, but whose strong showmanship qualities offer promise of wide audience appeal. A look at AA's summer product list offers firm confirmation that the transition has been accomplished. Of the 9 films ready for release between now and September 1960, at least 4 possess full-fledged possibilities of emerging as important money earners. Now, whether Brody really saw Tormented, which was already on the books, as that type of somewhat more important, prestigious type film, we don't know. But what we do know is that Film Bulletin, in a separate article, wrote, quote, "Tormented, described as a shocker, is set for August release and is to be teamed with an as yet unnamed science fiction entry." End quote. Nevertheless, things were moving a wee bit slow, perhaps in terms of Allied artists, perhaps in terms of final post-production on Tormented on Gordon's side. We don't know, but the completed film didn't get approval from the PCA. Here we're talking about the edited film. Earlier I was mentioning the screenplay. It didn't get PCA approval until the 3rd week of September 1960. And thus the film premiered not in August, but on September 25th, 1960. Tormented was released on a double bill with Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster, itself a pretty fascinating 1959 Italian film directed by Riccardo Freda and Mario Bava. Unfortunately, the film industry press largely ignored Tormented, and one of its major reviews, one of the few, appeared in the Hollywood Reporter, and I'd like to quote from it a bit now. Quote, "Despite its anguished title, Tormented is actually an attractive specimen of a species not often seen these days, the genuine ghost story. The Bert I. Gordon, Joe Steinberg production for Allied artists also is relatively clean of gore, despite its chilly nature, so it is not bad for the kids. Adults who favor these pictures will be diverted. Gordon and Flora M. Gordon did the special effects, which, as usual with the Gordons, are slick and convincing. The Gordons very cleverly use special effects to create the illusion of exterior sets. Carlson does nicely as the central figure, and Moppet Susan Gordon is beguiling." End quote. Unfortunately, the film Tormented did not do particularly well or register particularly across the United States. Most of the time it was dual billed with Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster. Sometimes it was not. It was, of course, up against competition that autumn of 1960 that ranged from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho to films like Ben-Hur, Let's Make Love with Marilyn Monroe, of course, and one of my old favorites, Ocean's 11. At any rate, the few reports that exhibitors sent to the trade press on the Tormented and Kaltiki double bill, well, not so great. From Cincinnati, we heard it was merely, quote, fair-ish. Business in Minneapolis was, quote, okay. Detroit, by contrast, had only, quote, slim business. And then from Buffalo we heard a report that was, quote, sad in terms of box office receipts. Tormented vanished from theaters after a period of months as it slowly made its way across the United States, and it appeared on television as early as 1964 and 1965. Regrettably, Tormented's original audiences were nowhere nearly as thrilled with the film as I am, and as I do hope you are. Of course, I'm so very happy with the film Tormented. I don't know how happy Gordon was, but what we do know is that during its initial period of release, that first month or so, Gordon had other problems on his mind. In late October of 1960, he brought a lawsuit against American International Film Distributing Corporation, American International Pictures, in other words, and its top officers, meaning Sam Z. Arkoff and James H. Nicholson, of course. He charged the two men with fraud in terms of their accounting on the 4 films he had made for AIP in 1957 and 1958. And he, among other things, contended while he was paid a fee for the 4 films, he was also supposed to get a profit participation amount that he did not receive. This would have been specifically for The Amazing Colossal Man, The Spider, Earth versus the Spider, War of the Colossal Beast, and Attack of the Puppet People. His lawsuit asked for $150,000 in damages, general damages, and $200,000 more in punitive damages. He went so far as to say that Nicholson and Arkoff had paid themselves $15,000 each for being executive producers on those 4 films when in fact they were not. Information about the suit seems to disappear from the trade press, so presumably the situation was settled. But this, of course, took up a lot of Gordon's time during the period of the film's initial weeks of release. So let's turn our attention now to the reasons why so many of us find Tormented wonderful and fascinating. It was released in 1960 at the period David Bordwell and other film historians would call the transition from classical Hollywood style to post-classical. All kinds of changes happening in the industry, on the screen, aesthetically, and in other respects. What we could certainly say is that this is that period when the old studio system is really breaking down, and with it the PCA's power, as filmmakers like Kubrick, we've mentioned with Lolita in 62, filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock with Psycho in 1960, and its vision of a on-screen depiction of a toilet, on-screen depiction of such murder with what some people at least took, wrongly as it happened, but took to be Janet Leigh's nude body. I know my own mother, when she saw Psycho at the time, was even shocked at seeing Janet Leigh in a bra in one scene. The PCA's power starts eroding very visibly around this time. And so that's a pivot point, a kind of an inflection point in the industry. No, all of this didn't happen exactly in 1960, but that's kind of a periodization marker we could use for this longer-term transition. And Tormented shows up right in the middle of it. It also shows up in the middle of something of a renewal of Gothic horror in the cinema that we would mainly attribute to the likes of Hammer in England with films like Horror of Dracula and Curse of Frankenstein and the many, many other films that company made as the 50s came to an end and into the 60s and beyond. We would also attribute the return of Gothic horror on screen to the likes of Roger Corman and Vincent Price with House of Usher in 1960 and subsequent films the two made together, Edgar Allan Poe adaptations and so forth. On the one hand, some of these films bear the hallmarks of a PCA in decline, meaning the more sexualized components of, say, the Hammer films in particular. Also, the lush color we get with these films that I'm now describing. But in terms of content, they moved, starting in the late 50s, away from the kind of sci-fi horror that even Bert I. Gordon had been known for, back to the kind of Gothic horror that had really been such an important feature of the 1930s horror film. Of course, when I think about, say, the Roger Corman Poe films, their sense of Gothic, among other things, many other things, is always waves crashing violently against a cliffside castle or palace of some type. And this is, of course, the beauty, the dramatic opening of Tormented with that type of of waves crashing, of that type of what we might call surf. And it's interesting that, of course, that's a feature that goes back to the earliest days of cinema, where audiences enjoyed watching images of waves crashing at beaches against rocks. Here I'm talking about Edison's film Surf at Long Branch from 1896. I'm thinking of In the Surf, which was shot in Atlantic City in 1897, or probably the very first of these ever made in California, like the beginning of Tormented, Surf at Monterey. That was another Edison 1897 film. And maybe most fascinating of all would be the British Mutoscope film from 1898 called Surf Crashing Against England's Rocky Coast. And so there's that tradition of that dramatic image that's sometimes part of Gothic horror films, but sometimes aside from them, outside of them. At the end of the day, I don't think we would really consider Tormented to be a Gothic horror film, certainly not like what Corman and Hammer were making at the time. At the same time, it's not a part of the burgeoning tradition of, to use a word that Variety actually used in 1960, gore, meaning the more increased bloody violence, the gore, the splatter, the slasher type films, which we start to see happening in the early 60s in an exploitation sense with the work of Herschel Gordon Lewis. We start to see it in various respects, like, say, Jack Curtis's film Flesh Eaters from 1964. And, of course, we particularly start to see it by the end of the 1960s and into the 70s, where that renewed sense of Gothic horror began taking an increasing backseat to the visceral gore and violence of films like Night of the Living Dead, George Romero's film from 1968, which exemplified not only the kind of gore and flesh-eating of the zombies, but even a nude zombie, another sign of the PCA's complete decline and fall, really. And from there we could talk into the 70s with, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and on and on. So where we're at, though, is this interesting place where Tormented is not a science fiction film, it is not a gore film, and yet it's not really of that Gothic tradition that renews in the late 50s. So what is it, and why might that explain why some of us love it so much? Well, I think here is where we can, of course, say it's a ghost film. It's a ghost film that actually can be a reason that makes my earlier mention of The Shining more relevant, even though Tormented comes 2 decades prior. Here we could think about this interesting feature of some ghost and supernatural stories that may or may not always be, strictly speaking, ghost and supernatural stories. What am I talking about? I'm talking about, I guess the best way to say it would be to use the words of the theorist Zeytan Todorov, whose book, The Fantastic, was published in French in 1970. In it, he suggests the following, quote, "The fantastic we have seen lasts only as long as a certain hesitation, a hesitation common to reader and character, who must decide whether or not what they perceive derives from reality as it exists in the common opinion." End quote. Okay, more specifically what this means is that Zeytan Todorov used the term fantastic to describe those moments in a book, of course, that he was talking about literature, but we would ascribe to films too, where maybe the supernatural is at play, maybe not. We're not entirely sure. This is very core to Kubrick's The Shining. For much of the time, only Nicholson sees the ghosts, and we're not sure if he's really seeing ghosts, or are they merely products of a deranged mind. At a given point in The Shining, a ghost lets Jack Nicholson out of a locked storage room, and we come to the conclusion that's reinforced later in that film when Shelley Duvall and others start seeing, what appear to be very real ghosts rather than just the imagination of one character. And so this is not unlike what the ghost of Tormented seems to be, how that ghost acts. Is it really a ghost out for revenge, or is it merely something conjured by a guilty imagination? Tom's, meaning, of course, the character Richard Carlson plays, Tom's guilty imagination. The hesitation, the not knowing exactly is very apparent throughout Tormented, I think. For example, when Vi's body first washes up and Carlson finds it, it turns out to be nothing more than seaweed. Tom sees the decapitated hand of Vi, but Sandy cannot. Tom sees footprints on the beach, but they aren't visible to Meg. Of course, he grabs Vi's head at one point, and it seems so very real. But in its bag, when Nick, Joe Turkel's character, opens the bag, it's merely flowers. So these are all the reasons that we might suggest that there's this kind of fantastic, as Todorov calls it. Is there a ghost? Is there not? As time goes on, of course, we become more convinced, as we do in The Shining. Mrs. Ellis, played by Lillian Adams, hears Vi's laugh at the lighthouse, for example. There's also suggestions of maybe the kinds of indirect signs of the supernatural, the scent of Vi's perfume, even a reference to cold spots, of course. It's really, though, for sure, at the end of the film, when we know, without doubt, that there are ghosts. The seaweed on Meg's wedding dress, the flowers dying, I think really one of the great special effects in the film, the flowers dying as Vi's ghost enters the chapel, and even the pages of the clergyman's book turning, thanks to the wind of the ghost, to the burial of the dead text. And if we're still not entirely convinced, which I think we would be by then, we know without doubt that when Vi's body shows up on the beach and then Tom's, we see Vi wearing what she could never have worn otherwise unless the supernatural was at play, and that is the wedding ring that would have been what he intended for Meg. So that's one element of Tormented that I think is fascinating. Another, of course, is its setting on an island. According to the PCA file, it is a, quote, unidentified resort island. And the island provides the type of situation that horror so often needs. In the 21st century, horror films set in the modern day have problems, like the fact it's hard to be out of contact with the rest of the world, smartphones and so forth. By contrast, isolation provides exactly what most horror stories have needed for the victim or victims, even would-be victims, to be someplace where they are largely isolated. Castles, Gothic castles, to return to the Gothic. Films, so many of them, the old dark house genre, Dracula 1931, were stuck at a asylum outside of London with a vampire on the loose. To be trapped in a rural house, and that's not just, of course, the old dark house, but it's all the way through films like Night of the Living Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. To be trapped in isolation, to be trapped in a place where it's not easy to leave. This, of course, provides the reason for Nick to blackmail Tom, that he knows Vi didn't leave the island. And islands feature so fascinatingly in stories like The Island of Dr. Moreau, the H.G. Wells story from 1896, and then, of course, made into more than a few films, most notably Island of Lost Souls in 1932. We could mention here The Most Dangerous Game, the 1924 short story that gets made into films, most notably perhaps the 1932 version with Leslie Banks. All kinds of other horror films. Haunted Island is a universal horror film, George Wagner's from 1941, that I've always enjoyed. But getting people to an island setting cuts them off from much of civilization and from much escape. And we see this in some of the earliest horror films, like Haunted Island from 1914. We could also mention The Pines of Laurie from 1914, which was one of the early horror pictures that I wish most was not lost. In it, a couple of characters, a man and a woman, survive a shipwreck, find themselves on an island. They find a mysterious home, one that's fully provisioned. It's not deserted, but it's totally unoccupied for a dead man sitting upright in the garden. And nearby is a grave, which he had evidently dug for himself. They bury him and build a raft to escape, but one of the survivors washes out to sea and suffers from madness. So islands have this great tradition in horror as far as isolationism. More specifically, more fantastically wonderful, I think, is Tormented's reliance on a lighthouse. And all that can possibly mean. This lighthouse that we learn is dangerous. This lighthouse in Tormented that is soon to be torn down. This lighthouse that Vi visits, asking Tom, "Show me the light, darling." And they ascend. This institution of light, the fiat lux, of course, becomes fiat tenebris. Let there be light, let there be darkness. With Vi's demise, becomes then at the end of the film fiat lux again, with Sandy learning Tom is a murderer in the lighthouse itself, finding him out. Light and the lack thereof, so important to this film. We hear about the many, many candles that the soon-to-be married couple of Tom and Meg keep receiving as gifts. Now, when it comes to lighthouses, there's such a wonderful possible setting for horror films. I suppose in terms of antiquity, we would of course think of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. But it's also interesting to note that the real golden age of lighthouses, particularly in the United States, was really around 1840 to 1940. At that time, over that century, the U.S. went from having about, say, 16 lighthouses to about 1,500. And there's obviously some that have long been associated with ghost stories, such as the lighthouse at St. Augustine in Florida, wonderful ghost stories associated with it, and so many others. The use of the lighthouse was not lost on authors of the 19th century, of course. John Ross Dix published The Haunted Lighthouse in 1858, and one passage from it, a character says the following, quote, "I stood where I was, seemingly rooted to the spot and almost petrified with horror. Suddenly the tapping at the window pane was repeated, and at the same moment the logs on the fireplace blazed up fiercely. I glanced towards the window, and there, pressed against the glass, was a human face, its eyes glaring fiercely at me, its cheeks pale, its lips blue, and the long black hair of its head mixed with tangled seaweed, streaming with brine. I rushed to the end of the chamber, but those eyes ever followed me." And of course that character is in a lighthouse when that scene occurs. It wasn't just literature, though, where lighthouses became a useful setting. It was also theater. Wilkie Collins, the author, the novelist, we would know his stories such as The Woman in White from 1860 and The Moonstone from 1868. Collins wrote a stage play called The Lighthouse, which was produced by Charles Dickens, who was Collins' mentor. It was produced first in 1855. And it really told the story of a murder that seems to have been committed in the distant past. It's a character who, as a result of nearly starving to death, the character who is in fact a lighthouse keeper, he confesses to having taken part in someone's death. And this was actually Collins' first stage play. It certainly wasn't the last that used lighthouses, though. There was also Dead Man's Point, or The Lighthouse of Carnruth, from circa 1871. And then there was Vesper Bells from 1890. And in the second act of that play, a character is saved from a watery grave by a dog. So she survives, unlike Vi in Tormented. And her survival spoils the plans of some of the villains who were out to end her existence. So there's literature, there's stage, and there was even, perhaps better remembered, radio in the days of radio drama. The French story Three Skeleton Key. It was first published in English in 1937, and it was performed on radio programs like Escape in 1949, and later on the radio show Suspense. Some of the versions, and it was repeated due to its popularity, some of its versions starred Vincent Price as one of three lighthouse keepers who are trapped, of course, because of the setting, and beset with rats, many, many rats, who reach the island aboard a shipwreck. Of course, early cinema saw the great potential of the lighthouse as a setting. The earliest film probably worth noting would be Biograph's The Lighthouse, released in 1907. In it, a lighthouse keeper and his daughter tend to the light. The lighthouse keeper has been able to save a goodly amount of money, and according to the Biograph description, quote, "On a wild night, robbers effect an entrance to the lighthouse, murder the keeper, and steal his savings." The film's publicity made clear that, quote, "all of the outdoor scenes were taken in the vicinity of one of the most historic lights on the New England coast," end quote. They did in 1907 what Bert I. Gordon did in 1960, filming one of the great lighthouses on the East Coast, even though, of course, Gordon used his to marry with footage shot in Malibu. Of course, lighthouses in the cinema have a wonderful history after that Biograph film. And joining me now to give an overview, wonderfully, is my friend, one of my favorite filmmakers, Larry Blaymeyer, best known, of course, for The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra from 2004. So please, Larry, tell us a little bit more about lighthouses in the cinema.
One element of Tormented, which I think helps it quite a bit, is the use of the lighthouse. Lighthouses in movies are like the Moors. It's hard not to picture them shrouded in fog and mystery. It's like instant atmosphere, a ready symbol of isolation and loneliness. A lighthouse can be a petri dish of suppressed emotions of jealousy, resentment, obsession, and paranoia. And practically speaking, it's a one-stop location for the budget-conscious. Over the years, its isolation and confinement have made it an effective old dark house substitute, as in the wonderfully bonkers and surreally comedic Shh the Octopus from 1937, where the old dark house's traditional clutching hand becomes clutching tentacles, or the entertaining 1942 British Arthur Askey comedy Backroom Boy, with its 10 Little Indians' third act, as a literal bevy of beauties disappears from the lighthouse one by one. On the darker side, the more horrific old dark lighthouse in 1972's Tower of Evil, aka The Horror of Snape Island, is used to chilling and suspenseful effect. And my favorite Doctor Who serial, Horror of Fang Rock from 1977, has the unfortunate denizens of a lighthouse both possessed by and besieged by Lovecraftian monsters. Of course, a lighthouse is perfect for a love triangle, as in Frank Strangler of the Swamp Vizbar's excellent B-movie Lighthouse from 1947, with fine performances from John Littell and June Lang. The triangle gets an interesting twist in 1941's British Tower of Terror as wartime intrigue meets psycho thriller, with the excellent Wilfred Night-Has-Eyes Lawson as a lighthouse keeper whose spiral staircase doesn't go all the way to the lamp, if you know what I mean. Wartime intrigue also drives Edward Dmytryk's lively 1942 RKO programmer 7 Miles from Alcatraz, as escaped convicts, well played by James Craig and Frank Jenks, take over what might be the homiest, coziest lighthouse in film history. Like many criminals in the 1940s, they decide that fighting Nazis is more important than fighting the law. The lighthouse becomes something of a microcosm here, as it does in the Bolting brothers' strange 1942 morale booster, Thunder Rock, adapted from the hit play. Reclusive writer-journalist Michael Redgrave, think isolationist, finds he can't run away from the war, even in a lighthouse, thanks to the help of the ghosts of a shipwreck which he conjures in his own mind. Maybe. Of course, most recently, the lighthouse as psychological pressure cooker was chillingly realized in Robert Eggers' 2019 The Lighthouse, with intense performances by Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. And although we never actually get inside it, how can I not mention the second episode of The Adventures of Superman, The Haunted Lighthouse?
Help! Help! I'm drowning! Oh!
Well, we so much appreciate Larry Blameyer joining us for that history. And this overall history of lighthouses as a place where things spooky can occur. It's actually worth noting to conclude on this subject, I think, that in 1960, a quite notable murder took place at a lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. After a manhunt, the murderer in that case was caught. The press internationally made some great mention of this story that came pretty close to the time that Tormented was released. Of course, I'm also intrigued by the use of jazz music in Tormented. Tom is allegedly the piano genius of jazz, although frankly I think Nick, Joe Turkel's character, is far more the hipster in his lingo and everything. Vi is herself a jazz singer, played of course wonderfully by Juli. The actual recording, though, we hear, the phonograph recording, is the singer Margie Rayburn. Just as the on-screen father, Meg's father, is played by Harry Fleer, but we actually hear Paul Frees doing his voice, dubbed in after the fact. But in terms of jazz, we can mention jazz and blues, thought of as the devil's music throughout the early mid-20th century, from Robert Johnson allegedly selling his soul to the devil, the blues musician, through to jazz music, particular songs from the original Dixieland jazz band's Satanic Blues, to Glenn Miller's Swingin' at the Seance, jazz and the spooky cartoons of Max Fleischer, like Minnie the Moocher from 1932 or Snow White from 1933. Of course, it's Tom's being a piano player that reminds me of Edgar G. Ulmer's 1945 film Detour. Both lead actors are piano players. Both lead actors end up becoming doomed, in some measure due to external forces. The lead character in Detour accidentally murders the woman who's blackmailing him. To an extent, so too does Tom, although he seems more vicious and willing to knowingly let Vi die. She does seem to have threatened him with the letters and possible blackmail. Tom in Tormented is in some ways driven by external forces, Vi even taunting him into murdering Nick. And yet, of course, none of this is to excuse him. He's a completely horrible person. He seems, by the end of the film, willing to murder a child, not unlike Joseph Cotton's character Uncle Charlie in Alfred Hitchcock's 1943 film Shadow of a Doubt. We could, of course, further the connections to noir by mentioning the incredible, I think, cinematography of Ernest Laszlo, who had shot a number of noirs, including most famously DOA in 1950 and Kiss Me Deadly in 1955. All that said, though, Tormented isn't a noir. It's just similar in some respects. Overall, to come to a conclusion, I would view Tormented most excitedly as something of an example of what I would call a cinema of anxiety, a cinema of uncertainty. It reminds me of something like a Twilight Zone episode, the Zone having first been broadcast in 1959. Reminds me a bit of films like Curtis Harrington's Night Tide, 1961. Even Herc Harvey's Carnival of Souls, 1962. Bert I. Gordon has taken us to a strange place in more than one respect, and I'm deeply grateful for it. Just as I'm deeply grateful for this tremendous restoration of the film, it deserves to be heralded, to be revisited, and certainly in this beautiful version on this disc.